Welcome everybody for the second day of the second Metroclima workshop. Today we will focus on aerosol characterization and source and atmospheric modeling. I added some co-authors, but I know the aerosol component is larger than all the names I put there, so I'm sorry for not adding everybody, but I know the list is larger than that. This is the schedule for today. So I will give a little introduction on the aerosol characterization and sources, and then we have other presenters here. So the motivations to include aerosol characterization and source identification in Metroclima project comes from the IPCC. The last report published last year shows that when we consider the period, the difference between 2010 and 2019 compared to the previous years from 1850 to 1900, we see a global warming of about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And when we look at the right panel, we see that the contribution to cooling is mainly due to the aerosol particles in the atmosphere. So aerosol has a very important impact on climate also. And when you are zooming in, we see a little red bar showing warming of the climate. And we see that this contribution comes from black carbon. So aerosol can contribute to cooling the system or to warm the system, adding to the greenhouse gases that Metroclima wants to study in São Paulo metropolitan area. Other information regarding aerosol properties comes from single scattering albedo. Single scattering albedo is the property that defines the aerosol ability to absorb or scatter radiation. So the higher the single scattering albedo, the higher the scattering ability. So here I highlighted the line showing the single scattering albedo. And in general, for urban, industrial, and mixed areas like Greenbelt in the United States, Crete in Paris, we see a very high single scattering albedo, 0.98, 0.94, a little bit lower in Mexico City, like 0.90, and Maldives, 0.91. So they show constantly higher single scattering albedo when we talk about urban emissions. But in fact, the presence of black carbon can down the single scattering albedo values. And according to a paper published by Maria de Fátima Andrade in 2012, in São Paulo, black carbon corresponds to about 36% of PM2.5, the fine mode of aerosol particles in São Paulo. And another paper, actually what motivated the inclusion of aerosol in Metroclima, was published by Vanderlei Martins and collaborators in 2009. In the larger plot, we see the mass absorption efficiency as a function of wavelength for two sites, urban sites in the east coast of the United States at Wallops and in São Paulo. And we see that the mass absorption efficiency in São Paulo is really larger than at another urban site. And if we zoom in the UV or shorter wavelengths, we see that there is other type of aerosol that can add more absorption than the typical curve expected for black carbon. So there is a chemical composition of aerosol in São Paulo that can be much more absorbing in the UV spectral region than observing in other urban areas around the globe. And when we studied the transport of biomass burning, because in general, people think that when we have biomass burning smoke from other regions, then we have a lower single scattering albedo. But it's the opposite. Here we see a time series from August 21 to August 27 of single scattering albedo retrieved by the Aeronet site. And when the single scattering albedo was lower, equal to 0.83, it was assigned to local sources. And when we had a smoke transport from central Brazil or the Amazon, then a single scattering albedo was higher. And, And when we look at the single scattering albedo data for biomass burning, even in the Amazon forest, we see, again, higher values of single scattering albedo. Cerrado vegetation presents a little lower, and African savanna, even lower values. But we don't have African savanna burning here in Brazil. So depending on the combustion efficiency, the type of vegetation burned, the amount of water present in the biomass, it can have a lower single scattering albedo. But even in boreal forest, also larger values. And analyzing Aeronet data of single scattering albedo level 2.0, we see that single scattering albedo varies a lot in São Paulo. So the data started at 2000, and at level 2.0, we have data up to 2021. And we see a large variability in single scattering albedo, showing that aerosol composition in São Paulo is very complex. And I forgot to mention, Martins associated the more absorbing aerosol to the organic compounds present in aerosol in São Paulo. So that's why we decided to investigate that at Metroclima. Just to show you the impact of the higher concentration of aerosol in the atmosphere measured by AOD, aerosol optical depth, as a function of less solar radiation reaching the surface. So the higher the AOD, the lower amount of solar radiation reach the surface. And not only the concentration matters, but also the single scattering albedo. The lower the single scattering albedo, the less solar radiation reaches São Paulo. So in this context, in the Metroclima project, new filters were collected, and similar optical analysis will be performed, and we will try to compare with chemical composition to try to identify what's the source, what's the compound present in the aerosol that makes the mass absorption efficiency larger or higher. So those are the references, and I thank you for your attention. And continuing, I will leave the schedule for today. Next presentation is by Guilherme Pereira. Okay. Or maybe we can invert because I have to leave earlier. Okay. While Guilherme puts his presentation here, if anybody has questions, I'm glad to answer. I have questions. Okay.
but it's more a technical question. When you show the AeroNet 2.0 data, what does the 2.0 mean?
Very good question, Diogo. Yeah, AeroNet data has 3 levels. The first one, 1.0, is only cloud contamination cleaned. The 1.5, also cloud contaminated data. No, sorry, 1.0 is raw data. All data that the photometer measures is available there. And then they make a cloud screening on the data. It's level 1.5. Level 2.0, the instruments go back to Goddard, and they make another calibration, and all data are corrected for the new calibration. So that's the high-quality data from the AeroNet. So who wants to use the 2.0 level is the best aerosol data available, okay? Thank you.
Questions? Marcia, one question. When you said about that it's not only black carbon that is absorbing, you are you don't use the name brown carbon, but you are referring to what is brown carbon?
No, for black carbon or for the more absorbing?
The other absorbing that is
Oh,
not
no.
black carbon.
There is a paper by Jacobson. He guesses that can be PHA.
HPA.
HPA.
No, PHA.
No, PHA.
Yes,
Polycyclic aromatic.
Hydrocarbons.
Yes.
Aromatic.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. And I have another question. It's about the amount of black carbon in São Paulo that now the new measurement, also measurement that Caroline is performing, it's showing that black carbon has decreased the participation PM 2.5.
Interesting.
Probably
Probably because of better control, better.
Yes. The new standards for emissions has decreased the particles in the diesel emission, and then the participation is not so high as 30%.
Good to know. Good to know. I don't. Well, I will check later if single scattering albedo has increased in the last, because in autumn, if you pay attention, do you know when it changed?
I'm measuring since last year.
But it is
Oh,
it was
it's not
it was
my presentation. Sorry.
no it was before, because that it was 2012. I think from 2015 2018 the participation of black carbon has decreased.
Oh,
I can well, we can put this in a graph, and then it's not published, but we have data from different papers and different theses, and we can join all this information and we can give it to you to compare.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay. So, Guilherme?
I'm going to choose this one. So, good afternoon. I'm going to present this about the emission factors in a biofuel impacted metropolitan area. First, I'm going to make an introduction. Metropolitan area of São Paulo, as we know, is the largest in South America. In the last decades, its vehicular sources have become the main source of particulate matter. And as we know, particulate matter include toxic species as some polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and metals. And also black carbon or elemental carbon, which is emitted mainly by diesel-powered heavy vehicles, and is related to climatic effects. It has an absorption of light by aerosol particles. Well, controlling these emissions from diesel and gasoline vehicles is important for policies to improve the air quality in metropolitan areas like this. And in Brazil, we know that there is a very high use of biofuels in the last 30 years. It has been increasing year by year. And tunnel studies are very important to evaluate emission factors in real vehicle conditions and the variation through the years of these emissions. And in the tunnel, we can see all types of emissions: exhaust pipe emissions, tire wear, brake lining wear, and pavement abrasion in this tunnel microenvironment. To do this, we performed in 2018 sampling of high-volume samples in 2 tunnels: Jânio Quadros tunnel, which is impacted by light duty vehicles, and Rodonel by light and heavy duty vehicles, and collecting PM 2.5 and PM 10, sampling inside and outside these tunnels. And later, we performed chemical characterization of this aerosol, analyzing the samples for different compounds, for water-soluble ions, elements, carbonaceous species as organic elemental carbon, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and derivatives, alkenes, propanes, and polyorganic species. Then we made, with these results, we calculated the emission factors in a simplified way by this equation, where it goes the difference of concentrations measured inside and outside the tunnels for the pollutants, considering the CO2 and CO measured inside and outside, and also the carbon weight fraction of the fuel. Okay, then we converted this from mass of particulate matter per kilogram to particulate matter emitted by kilometer by each vehicle. Okay, then we have these results. This first one for particulate matter, OC and EC, we see higher emission factors for heavy duty vehicles. We see that although it's very high, it is lower than the observed in 2004 and similar to the observed in 2011. Brazilian emission control program, PROCONV, changed in 2012 to phase P7 for HGVs, which is similar to Euro 5, and phase L6 for LGVs, which is similar to Euro 4, implemented in 2005. So we could see this reduction compared to 2004. This year, there was an update of PROCONV, and we may expect changes in the next sampling. Okay. The OC and EC were presented higher emission factors for the heavy duty vehicles, 25 times higher than the light duty vehicles. We will see later that despite this higher emissions of HGVs, the LDVs emit more toxic species. Higher fine black carbon emission factors were observed in previous studies. So this also points to a reduction of black elemental carbon in 2004, 2014, 15. There was also a reduction of OC emission factors if compared to 2011 for PM 2.5. And here we have the fractions of OC that we could analyze in the thermal optical analyzer. We can see that the heavy duty vehicles is dominated by AC3 in a very interesting way, which is much higher than the rest. So it may be a tracer for diesel emissions we can use in PMF models, receptor models. And these ATVs presented higher emissions also for OC1 and OC2, which are more volatile fractions compared to OC3 and OC4. And also, this showed up this pyrolyzed carbon here, which is less volatile than the other fractions and may indicate the influence of biodiesel blends. This should be investigated. Well, and also for light duty vehicles, there's a contribution of all OCC fractions differently from here, except the first one, which is the most volatile, and EC4. Here we have the water-soluble ions emission factors. We see that for the light duty vehicles, we see a lot of calcium and magnesium in both fine and coarse fractions. The coarse mode, magnesium, calcium, may be related to soil resuspension, and the fine mode, magnesium, calcium, to ultrafine particles from lubricating oil. We also see sulfate and nitrate emissions. Despite the secondary formation, it may be related to the resuspension of the road dust that contains it. Well, for the elements we have here, we see for the light duct vehicles a lot of iron and copper, an abundance of iron and copper, which is related to ethanol and gasoline-powered vehicles, along with metals as nickel and cadmium. And also we see even higher emission factors than 2004 for copper. So we may relate it to the content of ethanol in the fuel, the increasing content of it. Maybe because it's the presence of copper in the fuel and also the corrosion of the engine. Okay, but we also see here a very high coarse emission factor for iron, which may be related to metal plates inside the tunnel. So this is maybe not related to the vehicles and also to internal source inside the tunnel. Okay, barium was also observed in high concentration, in high emissions, may be related to brake abrasion, and was also a lot present in the coarse fraction. And possible, we saw higher emissions of brake-related species as antimony and barium, which may be related to a higher activation of the brakes inside the Jânio-Quadros tunnel, which is more curvy than Rodonel. And here, for diesel, we could not determine a lot of emission factors for some species because there was a problem with the calculation. We had to discount the contribution of light duct vehicles, so we could not calculate it for iron and copper, but we see here that zinc and lead were among the most abundant elements in the diesel emissions. It may be related to diesel vehicle lubricating oil, this species. Also, lead is associated with vehicle exhaust, and zinc to brake wear. And also, lubricating oils can contain approximately 100 ppm of zinc, so it may explain this. Here we have the polar organic species. We see that phthalates were the most emitted polar species for both vehicles, both type of vehicles. It can be related to tire softeners. And even we see some saccharides that they appeared for the heavy duty vehicles. We even saw levoglucosan, which is atypical because it's most related to biomass burning. But in the paper of Célia Alves, I think published last year or the other year, it was observed in tire and wear particles. The high temperatures reached in the vulcanization process or the friction between the tire and the pavement could convert cellulose into fibers, into monosaccharides. So it may explain this. Okay, and here we have the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the PA8s. We see higher PA8s, total PA8s emissions for heavy duty vehicles, and also oxy-PA8s, which are derivatives of the PA8s. We see that there is a high emission of PA8s for the heavy duty vehicles, but for low duty vehicles, it's the species with higher molecular mass, they are more emitted. They are more toxic, these ones, with 5, 6, and 7 rings. They don't appear, they did not appear here for the heavy duty vehicles. So we see that heavy duty vehicles may emit more PA8s, but the light vehicles emit more carcinogenic ones. Comparing with, I compared with other studies performed in recent years, and interestingly, we saw a lower emission of PA8s than other studies, relatively lower. It may be related to the use of biofuel in Brazil. So there is this study with dynamometer where they found lower pH emissions for ethanol-powered vehicles compared with only gasol-powered ones. Well, here I'll present about the toxic species. Concerning the carcinogenic elements, nickel and cobalt showed higher emission factors for the light duty vehicles, while lead, cadmium, and arsenic showed the higher emission factors for heavy duty vehicles. Lead, it's interesting because among the toxic species was the most emitted for both vehicles. So, and concerning the pH, I calculated this equivalent toxicity of benzoyl, which is related to carcinogenicity, and it was higher for the light duty vehicles, much higher. These values were within that I obtained for light duty vehicles. They were similar to the observed previously for dynamometer studies for gasol, but they were even higher than those observed only for vehicles powered by ethanol. Okay. Well, now I'm going to present the final comments, conclusions. These emission factors they were obtained by for Metropolitan area of São Paulo. I think this is the most complete we had until now. We observed lower emission factors for light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles if compared to 2 decades ago, showing an effectiveness of the policies. We see that for light duty vehicles, iron and copper were the most abundant emissions. It can be related to the fuel ethanol, engine corrosion, also braking sources. And for HDVs, the heavy duty vehicles, zinc and lead were observed in the firing modes. They can be used as tracers for this type of vehicle. Okay, and they may be associated with emission from lubricating oil and also a little bit of the lead in the fuel, although it's more controlled now, and zinc from the brake wear. Okay, concerning there may be an influence of biofuels concerning a relative lower emission of pH compared to other countries, and the light duty vehicles showed a much higher amount of carcinogenic species, except for lead, cadmium, and arsenic. And the associated toxicity was calculated for the first time for a Brazilian fleet, and of course it was obtained previously in a dynamometer, but now in real conditions. And it pointed to a greater carcinogenic potential for the LDVs, light duty vehicles emissions, compared to heavy duty emissions, which is worrisome since most of the fleet is composed of light duty vehicles. Okay, and that's it. Thank you. Okay. As perguntas depois.
Depois, né? Questions at the end, okay?
So next, please.
Next, I have to look at. I don't know. Next talk will be given by Thiago Nogueira. He will talk about gaseous compounds and emission factors. Thiago, please.
Okay, thank you, Marcia. Can you see my screen, right?
Richard, você coloca na tela, por favor? É o contrário, a apresentação do Thiago.
tô projetando minha tela, certo?
Ô, Richard, eu tenho que tirar a minha para poder aparecer? Pode deixar? Tá. Só precisa mostrar a tela do Thiago aqui na nossa tela. Agora foi, Thiago, por favor, pode começar. Obrigada.
Thank you, Marcia. So I'm going to talk about the emission of gaseous pollutants from vehicles here in São Paulo. This result is also from the tunnel experiment that Guilherme just talked about. Okay, so in fact, all of the results that I'm going to talk are in this paper that we published recently in Environmental Science and Technology, titled Evolution of Vehicle Emission Factors in a Mega City Affected by Extensive Biofuel Use, Results of Tunnel Measurements in São Paulo, Brazil. The objectives of this study were determine the emission factors for CO2, CO, NOx, SCO2, and ethanol emitted by vehicles running on gasoline plus ethanol and running on diesel plus biodiesel using these tunnel measurements. And also evaluate the emission factor trends in the last 20 years, and finally evaluate the use of emission factors obtained here in this study in emission inventories and air quality models. So here this map shows the location of the tunnels that we used in this study. So in 2018 and 2011, the measurements were carried out in Jânio Quadros tunnel that allowed the traffic of only light vehicles, as Guilherme said before, and in Rodonel tunnel with a mixed fleet of light vehicles and heavy vehicles. In 2001 and 2004, it was carried out also in Jânio Quadros tunnel, but it was used the Maria Maluf tunnel to estimate the emission from light vehicles and heavy vehicles. The use of two tunnels is important to estimate the emission factors from light vehicles and from heavy vehicles. So to measure the pollutants emitted by the vehicles, we install the equipment inside and outside both tunnels. So here we see the temporal variation in CO2, CO, NOx, SCO2, and ethanol. During the Jânio Quadros tunnel campaign in 2018, so we see that peaks were recorded mainly on weekdays, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. So both peaks corresponding to the commuter rush hours. And as I said before, inside Jânio Quadros tunnel are allowed only light vehicles. So we used this data of this tunnel to calculate the emission factors from light vehicles. Now this figure shows the CO2 concentrations inside the tunnel in blue, and outside the tunnel in this black line. As we see here, the nighttime concentration, here that I'm showing you, the nighttime concentration were comparable inside and outside the tunnel. So we can assume the nighttime concentration as a background, okay? So the main source of CO2 inside the tunnel are vehicle emissions during all day. So this is important because To calculate emission factor, we need subtract the background concentration. So in general, we measure the pollutant inside the tunnel and outside the tunnel. So if we could use the nighttime concentration inside the tunnel, is good because there is no need for measurement outside the tunnel. So to check if this approach is fine, we compare results discounting concentration inside tunnel, using nighttime concentration, and using the outside concentration. So in this plot, we see that there are a strong correlation between both approaches. So discounting the nighttime concentrations appears to be a fair proxy for removing the contribution of background concentration, and this approach was used in this work to calculate the emission factors. So here we see the temporal variation during the Rodoanel tunnel campaign. In this tunnel, we have a mixed fleet, light and heavy duty vehicles. So we used the data of this tunnel to calculate the emission factor from heavy vehicles. So this table shows the mean values of each pollutant in grams per liter of fuel burned. As the fuel used by vehicles are composed predominantly of carbon atoms, then CO2 and CO are the main pollutants emitted by the vehicles. We also can see that emission of NOx and SCO2 was higher for heavy vehicles than for light vehicles, and that light vehicles also emit unburned ethanol. Now, this figure shows the evolution of emission factors over time here in São Paulo. So in this work, we address only emission factors for CO and NOx because they are the target of Brazilian legislation and have been monitored since our first experiment here in São Paulo in 2001. So the Brazilian National Program for the Control of Air Pollution Emission by Motor Vehicles, called PROCONV, was in phase 6 for light vehicles and phase 7 for heavy vehicles in 2018. So this figure shows the PROCONV phases and their respective legislated emissions limits between 2001 and 2018. This headline shows this limit value. And here we also see the emission values obtained in the tunnel experiments in 2001, 2004, 2011, and 2018. We see that in the early 2000s, mainly light vehicles emit large amounts of pollutants, values up to 8 times higher than that for new vehicles. We also see that emissions from vehicles was reduced in the last 20 years. This happened mainly due to the evolution of PROCONV in Brazil, called for improvements in engine efficiency, fuel quality, increases in biofuel content. Now this figure shows the trends in ambient CO and NOx concentration. So here in left side shows the concentration of CO and NOx in Congonha station operated by CETESB, and here at right axis shows the emission factor. So we see that between 2001 and 2018, the emission factor for CO was found to decrease around 5%, So this reduction, the reduced emission of CO, appears to explain the reduction in ambient concentration of CO. Regarding the NOx, the overall ambient concentration of NOx decreased by a mean of 2.9% per year, which is a reduction smaller than that observed for emission factors from vehicles. So maybe the reduction in emissions of NOx was offset in part by the increase in the size of the fleet here in São Paulo. And then we created an emission inventory using the emission factors obtained from the tunnel experiments. So this figure shows the official emission inventory published by CETESB. We also created a emission inventory using the emission factor provided by CETESB, but using the vein model, and also created, and we also created this inventory, emission inventory, using the emission factor obtained in the tunnel experiment. So, as we see here, the difference between CO indicates an underestimation in the emission inventories currently used for São Paulo. So to demonstrate how the use of emission factor obtained in this study provides an improvement over air quality simulations in São Paulo, we choose to focus on CO because it was the pollutant with a great difference among the emission inventory. So these plots were obtained using WRF-Can. In this plot, the black line represents the observed concentration. The blue line represents a simulation using CETESB emission factor. And the head line represents the simulation using the emission factor obtained from the tunnel experiment. As we see here, using the CETESB emission factor, simulations using CETESB emission factors underestimated CO concentration during all day and failed to simulate the peak hour concentration. But when we use the tunnel emission factors, this peak were well represented for some stations. Okay. So this is all. Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Thiago. I will invite the next presentation. Next speaker is Leonardo Kamigauti. Questions will be by the end, okay, Thiago?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So pardon me, I need to. Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm gonna present some data from the magnetic analysis of the aerosols, but I'm gonna give an emphasis on the method because I think the method is very different from the methods chemical analysis that we are used to. So let's go. How to use this? Okay, it's okay. So when we look at this image, I don't know what you see, but I see a lot of iron being emitted from the car, from the soil. And when you do a chemical analysis of this iron, you're only gonna see iron, okay? The same you can see on this picture. Here on the marginal, that is a road here near the university. And you can see the same, a lot of iron here, a lot of iron on the, from the heavy duty vehicles, from the light duty vehicles. And it's a little bit obvious if you think, because the vehicles are made by the iron that comes from the soil. So we can exploit some things about the magnetic aspect of the iron to tell some histories and looking after some differences inside this data that the chemical analysis cannot see. So I'm gonna tell us very short and very small story about magnets. I hope you catch all the things because it's a lot of things. But okay, we have three materials, okay? What happens when we apply a magnetic field to these three materials? Well, it depends. There's materials that are diamagnetic that will be will react to this field, creating an internal field in the opposite side of the opposite direction of the field that you put. The ferromagnetics that gonna make a field in the same direction. The paramagnetic that gonna make a field in the same direction also. What happens when you remove this field that you are applying? Only the ferromagnetic maintains the field. So the ferromagnetics are the magnet, the literal magnets that you put on the refrigerator, no? So what is diamagnetic? Everything is diamagnetic. We are diamagnetic. This frog that is levitating inside a very big machine that is applying a very, very strong field is diamagnetic. So what's the, so it's analyzing the diamagnetic aspects of our samples. It's not so interesting because it's do not define any difference between the samples at all. And the diamagnetic force is very weak compared to the other two. So the paramagnetic is a little bit different. It's gonna depend on the spins of the electrons on the atoms. So for example, we have the sodium and the magnesium. And on the outer layer of the electron, on the layer 3s, we have two paired electrons on magnesium and one unpaired electron on sodium. And these pairs of electrons do its spins, and the spins of the electrons create like a very, very, very tiny magnet that when you pair two electrons, they can cancel with each one, so the sum is 0. But when they are free, they have a little magnetic force there. Okay, so the paramagnetic materials gonna be paramagnetic because of these free electrons. Okay, so this is the start of the day, the ferromagnetic materials. What they have, very interesting. Ferro, in Portuguese, it means iron. So you can suspect that iron is ferromagnetic. And not only that, iron is one of the most abundant elements that we have in the crust, and the Earth's crust. The other ones, like silicon, aluminum, magnesium, if you look there, they're up there, they have only in max 2 unpaired electrons. But iron here have 4. And not only that, we have on the 3D shell, that is an outer shell that can go farther from the atom nucleus and can interact with other ions. So with that interaction, we can preserve the magnetization that we put on the material, so they became magnets. Okay, So other very nice fact to us is that on the whole plethora of compositions inside the particulate matter, the iron is the most abundant metals that we have in the particulate matter most of the cases, especially the case of the tunnels that we are talking these last two presentations. So what's influenced the magnetism in the particulate matter? So we can imagine that inside the particle, the little particle that is in there, we have tiny magnetic materials spread inside the particles. They can have different compositions, crystalline, structural, or elemental compositions. They they have other things. They have forms, different forms, and different sizes. So the compositions, most of the compositions that we're gonna look after will be crystalline, crystalline differences. So we have magnetite and hematite that have different angles on the crystalline structure that makes it preserve more or less the magnetization. We have the form difference. So if I apply a field in a perfectly spherical particle, it's going to be magnetized in the same direction. But if the particle is elongated, it's going to be tilted. So it also influences the magnetization. And the other aspect that I think is the most important is the size. So the size is very tricky because you can think, oh, if I have a larger particle, if I magnetize it, it's going to be more magnet, right? But when I remove the field, this magnetization inside the large particle breaks up in little parts that can, in the total sum, become null. So you can zero the net magnetization of the particle. So in the practice, in the real world, the larger particles are less magnetic than the smaller ones. But if you pick a particle that's very, very, very small, and also remove the field that we're applying, the thermal energy gonna influence the atoms inside the crystalline structure, and will be greater than the magnetic energy, randomize the directions of the little magnets there, and again zero the magnetic force. Okay, so we have a double knife there. Okay, so we have some measurements of the tunnels. Again, in blue, the tunnels that we have have duct vehicles, and in orange, the tunnels that we have the light duct vehicles. And I made a measurement that in one axis, we do a measurement where we maintain the field, and the other axis that we remove the field. So it's going to be a very, a little play of these size things, because you can see that when you maintain the field, all sizes of particles will be magnetized, and when we remove that, we can see the differences on the sizes. So with that, we can see that the tunnel with the light duct vehicles have coarser magnetic particles than with the heavy duct vehicles. Okay, so other aspect that we can explore. We get the material, put the field, increase the field again, but there is one point that all the electrons of the material are going to be pointing in the same direction. So it's not matter how much you increase this field that you're applying. The material cannot magnetize more. This is the saturation magnetization of the sample, okay? When we remove that field, we can see the remanent saturation magnetization. Okay, because you remove the outer field, so it's the remanent magnetization, the remanent magnet, okay? Other aspect that we can see is apply the field in the other direction, opposite direction, and zero the field. That field that you use to zero the internal field of the sample is what we call coercivity. It's going to be more or less the size of the force that we need to counteract the magnetization of the sample. So more coercive samples are samples that is way harder to flip the magnetization of the particles, okay? But when we remove that field, a little remanence magnetization will appear on the particle. So you need to overshoot that field that you applied to zero the particle and remove that. This field that you overshoot is what we call coercivity of remanence. It's the other aspect of these interactions. Okay, so it can do this plot that is a very complex analysis that uses the remanent magnetizations of saturation and the coercivities, and with that we can see different aspects like the size of the particles. So the quartz particles gonna be down here on this part of the plot. The finer particles will be here, and that particles that is affected by the thermal force because they are very, very tiny, we can separate here. Okay, so we need to remember that we do not have pure material there in the tunnel, so all particles probably have all sizes of particles there. So the things are not very well defined, so they are more or less spread. But we can see differences in the tunnel with only the light duct vehicles here in orange and the tunnels there in blue with the heavy duct vehicles. And also these stars are very interesting. The colored stars are the soil of the tunnel, and they are on this other section of the graph that is not well explored in the literature, and it's very sad. And the soil and other soils that we collected also, not only with the standardized equipment, but also we literally collected the dust, the whole dust, not only the PM2.5, that is the squares. So the soils goes there. Okay, so we could separate all these things. What more we can do with magnetism? Well, another effect. If I apply the magnetization inside the PM particle, let's suppose that the PM particle, have two types of composition of crystalline structure or chemical composition of magnetic particles inside them, okay? So I apply a field, every particle gets a field, and I remove that field, okay? Some particles gonna shorten the field more than other particles. Like these reds have a lesser magnetization than the gray ones, okay? And let's apply a field in the other direction. So you can see, no, it's the opposite, sorry. We can see the gray magnetization being more affected for the field in the other direction. You increase the gray becomes zero in magnetization, the red gets smaller, and this processes, okay? So when you varies the field, you can see different behaviors depending on the chemical composition and crystalline composition of the sample, okay? And that is what we used here. So that differences that I talked about was related to the coercivity of the sample, right? Because the coercivity, again, is the force that you need to flip the field of the magnets, okay? So in this x-axis is the field that you needed the coercivity field that you needed to flip the magnets. And we have a measurement of the derivative of the field that I applied on there. So it's, the derivative of their field. So the derivative of their field gonna show us some populations of magnetic elements inside the sample. So we have here in yellow the total magnetic contribution, in purple one population, in blue other population. These other two samples we do not have two populations, so it's only yellow. There's the results for the tunnels, there's the soil, there's the tire. It's interesting to see that the peak of the soil in the tire is in the same spot that the purple population inside the tunnels. So this makes us believe that the purple population is related to this part of the emissions, soil and tire. And this other blue population that also have a higher intensity in the magnetic signal is onto the exhaust of the cars. So we can separate these two signals using this technique. Okay, so looking what we can do with the magnetic properties, we can distinguish vehicle types and separate soil dust from vehicle emissions. Okay, not only that, but we have other applications that was not made on this project, but I think it's cool to talk a little about, like application in biology. This is photos, photographs of brain sections of persons with Alzheimer. And Barbara Maher and collaborators found different types of magnetite inside the brains. The magnetite that they found have two different forms. One is spherical, another is more angular. And they attribute the angular magnetite to the magnetite that naturally occurs on our brain. So we have some there. But this one that is very round is normally associated with fuel emissions. Because of the combustion, the high temperature forms little spheres. Okay. So magnetic analysis can be used to that. And other things that we can do is use it to dispersion studies. So it's other dispersion study that I made with tree barks inside around the industrial complex, and we found some correlations between chemical and the magnetic analysis also that can prove that could prove that the industrial area was doing harm to the people around it. So, okay, so basically that's it. Thank you. Who's the next one?
Thank you, Leonardo. Now, well, the questions at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. And now I invite Carlos Oliveira for his presentation. The floor is yours.
Você colocou aqui. Hello. Som. Okay. Essa, isso. Isso. É assim. Não é? Eu tinha colocado esse nome. É. Eu tinha colocado esse nome. Não, fechou. Apesar que eu tenho pendrive também, se precisar. Ah, esse é verdade. Obrigado. Hello, good afternoon everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I talk about the isotopic tracers in urban aerosol to discriminate and quantify sources. It's slightly similar with the last presentations, which try to distinguish signatures, profiles, or magnetic properties in order to better understand the contributions of the source. In our case, we use isotopes, metallic isotopes, to this approach. Okay, I will show a brief background about the isotopic techniques and our previous works in this field. Some improvements and combinations with receptor modeling and cross-validation strategies, and most currently the iron isotopes applications to this approach. Is a new friend for us to help. Okay. As a background about the main technique is the traditional receptor modeling used to source apportionment, which use elemental profiles of the source in order to identify a specific source and quantify the source. However, this approach, the weakness is related to sometimes is difficult to differentiate the source using only elemental profiles, because it's a complex approach. In this case, we use isotopic signatures, which normally is specific for different sources. Normally, you use the ratio between two isotopes, in this case, for instance, for lead, 2006, 2007, or 2008 as well. And each source presents a characteristic signature which can be differentiated in the aerosol samples. The precision to identify and discriminate isotopic signatures and source is a powerful, interesting characteristic of isotopic fingerprint strategy. In theory, we have, as I have said, talked specific isotopic signatures for instance, to industries and vehicles, and you can quantify the contributions of this specific source in the aerosol, depending of the fraction of contribution of each source for specific elements. With its simple B plots, we can plot the isotopic signatures of this source and quantifying the contributions using mixed model for this approach. In practice, in the previous works, we get to differentiation between the contributions from vehicular traffic with a specific lead isotopic signatures. It's interesting that these signatures show reproducibility over 14 years in three different studies, and lead isotopic signatures as well of aerosol from Cubatão industrial area. This is the major industrial area around the metropolitan region of São Paulo, and it's very, very interesting approach. Differentiation two main important sources to urban aerosol in São Paulo. However, that this is the samples of different source: alcohol, gasoline, diesel, road dust, and aerosol from Cubatão. And here is the PM10 and PM2.5 fine and coarse aerosol collected in São Paulo City, here in University. It's very interesting that we can see the more contributions to aerosol is from vehicular traffic as expected, but in some specific days, when normally with cold front entrance in São Paulo, we observe the signatures coming from Cubatão industrial area. That's it's very interesting approach. It's confirmed by back trajectories, modeling, and other meteorological conditions specific. Yes. Another thing that we can, using zinc isotopes, we could differentiate between the contributions of no exhaust vehicular source here, road dust and tires, with higher zinc isotopes, delta values major than 0 per mil, and which is different from signatures of exhaust, vehicular exhaust source. So the zinc isotopes, we could differentiate between no exhaust and exhaust vehicular source. It's another interesting found. When you analyze lead and zinc isotopes in aerosol samples from São Paulo as well, we can observe that the main contribution is from exhaust. In some specific days, we also observe the important contributions from no exhaust, road dust contributions. In other specific days, we observe the major contributions from Cubatão industrial area. And most interestingly, we have another signature of a non-characterized source, but in literature, the light zinc isotopes is associated with industrial source mainly, or biomass burning source. So with the combination of zinc and lead, despite the distinguish no exhaust and the exhaust, you can distinguish Cubatão from the other possible industrial source in São Paulo. And seeing back trajectories, we can suppose contributions from different other industrial areas inside the metropolitan region. Okay, using a third element, isotopes of copper, we can distinguish as well from road dust and vehicular emissions contributions from cement of constructions and demolitions. That is another important source in São Paulo City. This is the previous background in previous publications during my PhD. We also show the main contributions of these industrial and vehicular. Vehicular show the major contributions. We use mixed modeling to make the quantifications of this source. Vehicular traffic have the major contributions. Cubatão area, industrial area as well have important contributions. And this another source, not characterized, isotopic characterized, but show as well important contributions to aerosol. Okay, in order to improve this source characterization, to, for example, identify, quantify other important source, we adopt the strategy to combine the advantages of isotopic fingerprint model with receptor modeling, PMF modeling. The advantage of PMF is related to solve chemical balance, analytical, include analytical uncertainties, but that have some limitations related to elemental source profiles and non-specific signatures in some for source in some case. The problem of the isotopic fingerprint model is related to it's not representative to total mass of particulate matter, because we quantify for its contributions for specific elements, not for whole mass of particulate matter. In this case, the main strategy is combining both models in order to improve the precision in source identifications, as well to report the isotopic model to whole particulate matter mass. We perform some correlations between the results of PMF model for the same samples, aerosol samples. Running the PMF model, we identify 5 sources here: traffic, industrial, vehicular traffic, secondary aerosol, and biomass burning. Interestingly, these results showed good correlations with isotopic signatures for example, road dust and the vehicular and other sources as well, and correlating the results, the percentage of source contributions of PMF with isotopic model here, which show good correlations as well. You can correct the isotopic percentage source contributions based on total aerosol mass. It's another important improvement related to combine both models. Another interesting contribution was to discriminate better some source, like, for example, industry. We can quantify the contributions of these different industries, Cubatão and other industrial areas. Quantify contributions from road traffic, no exhaust and exhaust. Quantify contributions of secondary aerosol and biomass burning, which is not identified by isotopes. And secondary aerosol is not identified by isotope as well. We can show this contribution and propose some signatures for isotopic signatures for this source that is very difficult to sampling, to collect sampling about this process. We suppose specific isotopic signatures. He is presented in this paper last year. Okay, the last improvement with the model we developed during my postdoc the procedure to analyze iron isotopes in the clean room laboratory. It's hard to analyze the iron isotopes. We needed to perform sample purifications with resin. After we needed to measure in high resolution spectrometry to make separations between the isobars and correct isotopic fractionation that occur in the instruments. But we can observe interesting signatures, iron, delta 56 signatures related to cement. It's slightly enriched in slightly positive delta values in relation against to raw dust and the vehicular source, no exhaust and exhaust, and observing the iron signatures regarding concentrations, we can differentiate between cement with specific signatures from vehicular and industrial area. This is from Cubatão industrial area. It's aligned with literature, with light iron isotopes. And we observed that the coarse fraction is more related to cement contributions, while fine its contributions for long range transportation and vehicular contributions. Well, to finish, we perform as well the mixed modeling to quantify contributions of these three sources for iron isotopes. Here, the contributions for some samples for fine and coarse aerosol. And fine aerosol, we observe more contributions from industrial area, while for coarse particles, cement and vehicular contributions. Here is a scenario of the main contributions to iron in São Paulo City, the internal contributions and long-range transportations. Yes, we have some perspectives to assess the contributions of anthropic iron to remote areas, to the ocean, for example, as well as other iron isotopic signatures of other sources, combining iron with other elements and improve the model and combine as well with receptor modeling. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. At the end, we are going to the questions, but now I invite Mario to make his presentation.
Hello, hello, hello.
¿Estão me ouvindo? Sim? Tudo bem? So, good day to everybody. My name is Mario. I'm a postdoc researcher here in the Institute. And I work with air quality modeling, and for that reason, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the atmospheric modeling studies that have been performed here in Sao Paulo. But before starting talking about air quality modeling, I want to put the quality modeling in a greater context. According to Bracer and Jacob and Senfilipandis, the atmospheric chemistry has three pillars. To study atmospheric chemistry, you need three pillars: the measurement from air quality stations, the laboratory experiments, and the atmospheric chemistry transport model or the air quality model. And these pillars aren't separated. They interact with each other. For example, the measurement from the air quality station provides the data to validate the air quality modelings. And when you run the air quality modeling, the models, you can identify pollutant hotspot where you should put a air quality station. On the other hand, you have the laboratory experiments that study a specific atmospheric process, and these results help the model to have better parameters, better inputs, better coefficients, better equation, better reaction. And when you apply the knowledge that you get from the laboratory experiment, you run your model and you see that reality beats the model. This process help us to understand the gaps in our understanding, to then go to the lab and improve the models. And we see that Metroclima project covers all these three pillars. And in yesterday and today, we talk about a lot of laboratory experiment and measurement. And I will try to speak very quickly about the atmospheric chemistry transport models. But there are many kinds of air quality modeling, so I will focus in Eulerian photochemical model. They are commonly known air quality modeling models. And I focus on ozone simulation and PM 2.5 simulation because these two pollutants are the ones that usually surpass the air quality standard, also has climate implication, and also they affect the health of the population. But before that, a little bit of history. The first quality modeling performed in Sao Paulo was made by Bishop Gope in the 98, and they focus on SO2 concentration in Cubatão, which is an industrial area. They use the CAM atmospheric modeling coupled with Dray's dispersion model. And the next year, Guardiani and collaborator performed the first statistical modeling using an artificial neural model to study the ozone concentration in Sao Paulo. So once upon a time, around 2001, the researchers started using Eulerian photochemical models. So I got 50 minutes to cover 21 years of research. From 2001 to today, we have 27 air quality model publications in Sao Paulo. The SIT model was the first one. And during this time, there have been 6 models were applied in Sao Paulo. The SIT models, the Brahms SPM model, WorkChem, CIMAC, CICAT Brahms, and Eurat M models. The ones in blue are offline models, and the ones in red are online models. The online air quality models simulate both meteorology and pollutant concentration, but offline model needs external meteorological input to do the calculations. So these figures summarize our data set of air quality modeling studies. We together with the simulation period they simulate, and the pollutant they focus, ozone or PM2.5. Right? And we see that most of the simulation study periods happens during Sao Paulo spring, And that can be explained because we usually simulate the worst case scenario, right? During spring, we have higher ozone concentration, and also during the end of the winter in September, we got the biomass burning episodes here in Sao Paulo, right? Also, we see that during the first 10 years, the main focus was ozone. Then during the 2015, PM2.5 became more important to study, and so more studies focused on PM2.5 were developed. Another important fact that we get from this figure is that there is only one study that performed a 1-year simulation, performed by Skowronik and collaborators. But that work used simulation of ozone and PM2.5 to estimate the health impact. But then we had some short periods of simulation, like three days, 1 week. There are some work that covers 1 month, and there are very few simulations during the fall in Sao Paulo. From our data set, we have 17 works that focus on ozone and 10 works that focus on PM2.5. From the same data set, we have that more than half of the studies use online model, which WorkN is the most popular. Most studies only use one domain, and if they use nesting domains with 3 are enough. And here is an important thing, that most of the work focus on the regional scale. Only 2 air quality modelings reach the 1 kilometers, that is the urban local scale. And most used performance statistics were the mean bias, the Pearson correlation, and the root mean square error. So this model use chemical mechanisms and aerosol models to estimate the pollutant concentration. Many models use different chemical mechanisms. From our data set, we find that the most common mechanisms were SAPRAC 99, carbon bond mechanism version C, carbon bond 5, radiant 2, and Mozart. And researcher has a special interest in choosing a chemical mechanism that explicitly represent the ethanol. In some cases, there were work when researchers adapt the mechanisms to explicitly represent the ethanol. When we talk about aerosol models, many also were used. And in more recent works, more complex mechanisms were used. For example, MADE-VBS can calculate secondary organic aerosols. How well the models performed in this time. These figures show the distribution of many performance statistics from the works that conform our data set. We use the suggested statistic and benchmark from Emery and collaborators. They suggest that Pearson correlation coefficient, normalized mean bias, and normalized mean error are enough to assess the performance of a model. They also suggest some benchmarks. For example, the goal benchmark, that means that if your model reaches those benchmarks, your model is doing, or your simulation is pretty good. And they also give us some criteria benchmark that say that your simulation is okay. And during this time, all the simulations of ozone performed in Sao Paulo reached the criteria benchmark for Pearson correlations. And more than a half reached the goal criteria. When talking about the normalized mean bias, most of the studies reached the criteria benchmark, but not the goal criteria for normalized mean bias. And for normalized mean error, only one work reached the criteria benchmark. Yeah. About PM2.5, we don't have enough data, so but most of the works reach the criteria benchmark for Pearson correlation for PM2.5 simulations. And when we review this paper, usually in the part of recommendation and conclusion, they always says we need to improve the emission inventories. We need to improve to calibrate the emissions. There are other sorts of challenges like what we talked yesterday about trying to represent planetary boundary layer, right? But they always says the guilty always is the emissions. In this work, we usually use the vehicular emission as anthropogenic emissions because it's the main source of pollution here in Sao Paulo, and for that reason we got a lot of information about vehicular emissions. We don't have enough information about other sources as industrials sources or domestic emission, right? And in some cases, we use global emission inventories to complete our total or atmospheric emissions. Also, different studies use different emission databases, and they usually use different methodologies to disaggregate emission in space and time. For example, we use night light to distribute especially our anthropogenic emission in the urban areas, or we use the street length in cell to distribute cars in its cells and the vehicular emission in those cells, right? Currently, there have been a lot of research in vehicular emission inventories. For example, we have the Bain emission model that create very good vehicular emission estimates. Other source of errors of emission inventories are that this work usually use standard day emissions, so they didn't separate the weekday holidays or weekend emissions, right? Other challenge that that run air quality modeling is that to run air quality modeling, you need to have a good computer, a good server. For example, if you run WorkChem only with gases, you will spend 5 times the time that you need to run WRF meteorology. But if you want to run WorkChem with gases, aerosols, and feedbacks between the weather and chemistry, you probably will spend like 10 or 100 times the time you need to run a meteorological simulation for the same period. Also, we need more observation and field campaigns. They are important to perform model evaluations. They usually improve our input. For example, we saw Thiago show us soon before that from tunnel experiment we get better CO emission factor that led to a better CO emission estimated that result in better CO simulation, right? And also from the same tunnel experiment we can get better temporal emission profile that help us to distribute the emission temporally. And we also saw during this presentation that we can get the aerosol composition, and the model also can give us those composition to compare and study, right? Most of the studies deals with model evaluation, trying to study meteorology and air pollution, but there were some topics that haven't been developed yet. For example, there aren't many works about the impact of different emission sources. There is only one work that uses modeling results to assess impacts on population health. There are many publications about climate change and air quality effects. I know there are some dissertation and theses about this topic, but we didn't find the publication papers. And also, these works usually use a station from the air quality network from CETESB, but we know that we have satellite data that can be used also to evaluate spatially the model. Also, that data simulation, inverse modeling hasn't been developed, studied, and even if I talk a lot about quality modeling, there are also, we couldn't find any modeling studies about greenhouse gases concentration. But lucky for us, the Metroclima project will target those topics. That's it. Thank you very much. And if you find any paper that can increase our data set, please send me a mail. I'll be grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Now I'm open for questions. Questions?
Okay, so I have a question to Thiago. First of all, congratulations for the great presentation. Looking into your final modeling, when you've got your updated emission factors, their impact in the modeling is remarkable. We can definitely see an improvement on the modeling. I'm just curious about what happens between 10 and 5 p.m. because apparently in the model there is there's still a gap in there, and I was curious if you have any hints as to what is happening in there. I know it's a recent study, but maybe you have some more info on that one.
Okay. Thank you, Diego, for this comment. In fact, I suggest you ask the same question for Mario. I think maybe Mario could answer this, but I think it's not easy to simulate PM. Yeah. But we also improved the emission factors for PM, but for modeling, I think it's not so good the result. Maybe Fatima or Mario can complement my answer. Okay.
In that case, during the morning and in the night, we could simulate the peak concentration, but during the afternoon there was some error, right? We seen that it's because there is our representation of the planetary boundary layer in the model. It's not so good, so I think it simulates a higher boundary layer that decrease the concentrations.
Questions? If people can ask, and then we can hear if you ask questions. People that are not here, that are not in person, but please raise the hand, and then we can see if you want to ask a question. But I would like to ask Carlos about now seeing the results. You have the signature for cement, but how is it different from soil, for instance? You know, because you put there, this is cement, this is industry, this is exhaust and non-exhaust vehicular emissions. But cement is not close to soil also.
Yeah. Thank you, Fatima, for asking for the question. In fact, for isotopes, the road dust and cement, it's slightly similar. Yes, in my presentation, cement is slightly heavier because it's slightly enriched by heavier isotopes. Maybe because of probably because of the rocks, the source of cement, the rocks, that is the mineral composition, while in the road dust it's a mix of the urban mix in the case of the road dust. The soil depends of the mineralogy of the place. In the case of geogenic soil, depends of the mineralogy, but in general, it's slightly enriched by heavier isotopes with delta values higher than 0. Yes, we can differentiate slightly, not only by isotopic signatures, but combined with concentrations as well. I don't know if I answered.
Thank you, Carlos. Questions? Well, I have many questions. Now I'd like to ask Guilherme. Guilherme, you at the end you presented the toxicity of the particles, and you said the light-duty vehicles has higher toxicity associated to HPA. But then I was thinking about if you consider not only the related to, because it's related to the incidence of cancer, no. But if you consider all the compositions, then it's going to be with the heavy metals, with the heavy-duty vehicles, no? Because they are emitting also more particles.
Well, yes, more particles, but with in the case of light-duty vehicles, there will be a higher concentration of the toxic species, mainly the PA8s. But yes, the heavy-duty vehicles will be in a higher amount of particles. But yes.
The metals, for instance, if you put there together
the metals, yeah. Yeah. But I don't know if there's a calculation including the metals. I used the calculation for the pH, but they use a TEF, which is a equivalent factor for carcinogenicity for each pH, which was calculated with experimentally in laboratory. I don't know that there is. I could not find it for metals, but it would be interesting if there is a way to calculate this. Probably it will be different if you include the metals too, for the heavy duty vehicles, yes. But considering that there are bigger vehicles, they will be emitting more particles, of course, yes. So that was only considering the organic part, the organic species. We measured in Portugal the toxicity of the particulate matter. We can try to calculate the emission factor for the toxicity, for the measured toxicity. So it will be interesting to see. Okay, but what I was trying to say is that the number of light duty vehicles in São Paulo is much bigger than the heavy duty vehicles. So that's why that is worrisome. And they emit a lot of this pH, this toxic pH. So that's it. Another question about the.
Okay, then, well, if no more questions, then we can. I'd like to thank everybody for being here and remotely, and we are going to have these workshops more frequent, to be possible to discuss the results of the project, because it proves to be very useful, because sometimes we don't know what other persons are doing in the project, and then we be aware of all the results and can make questions and suggestions and also think about new ideas. And then I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and have a nice day. Thank you. Obrigada, Richard. Pela